everyone, I am Leah Lawson with Pinkfresh Studio. I hope that you are enjoying this special at-home event with all of our friends and fellow members at the Stamping Village. I know that all of our friends and partners have worked really hard to put this show together and create some really inspiring projects to share with you today. So we hope that this leaves you inspired and ready to craft. At Pinkfresh Studio, we have a special discount on full-sized ink pads for you to help celebrate this fun event. We are giving you 20% off of our full-sized ink pads using the code INKPADS20. Now, don't worry if you don't remember that. It will be in multiple places for you to find, and we'll chat about it a little bit more as I flip my camera around and we get going on our card for today. So how about we get to it? You and I were going to make a really beautiful slimline card together today. So let's flip the camera around and get started.
As I mentioned, we are going to do a slimline card today, which are all the rage. We have a really great collection of essential slim cut dies at Pinkfresh Studio, and I just wanted to show them to you first before we get started. So we have a couple of great sets of edgers, along with two really great striped backgrounds. There are these peekaboo circle frame dies, which are, a full panel, and this ornate banner die set, which has the smaller banner nested in. Then we also have this diagonal stitched and stitched rectangle sets of essentials dies as well. Now, our largest die size is 3 5/8 by 8 5/8, which is the actual dimension of a true slimline card. Now, many people like to do the 3.5 by 8.5 size card base, and that is where those internal nested dies come in. Those are perfect for matting on the inside of that smaller card size if you want. So today we're gonna focus on the scalloped circles die and then the stitched die, and you're gonna see a really fun technique combining these two. So we're going to go ahead and get started with this inverted stitched scallop circle die. So what I do is I take my cardstock and I place it on my cutting plate, and then I go ahead and I place my die over top of it, and I make sure to tape the die down. And the reason that I do this is because these dies are really big and they can shift inside of your die cutting machine if you don't have them securely set down. So that is why I tape all of my slimline dies down. Now, I wanted to mention that I cut this out of 130-pound cardstock, which is a really great weight cardstock. So these don't need a shim, but you do want to make sure that your cutting plates are not warped and are in fairly good condition. Okay, so we already have that panel die cut, but I want to add that beautiful stitched edge. So all I'm going to do is I am going to line that scalloped circle panel into the stitched rectangle, the slim stitched rectangle. And I'm just going to use some tape to secure it to the die so that it doesn't shift. Now this part is actually really important. As you can see, I am taking two fairly long pieces of masking tape or delicate surface tape, and I am really taping down this die. And that's because these are not full panel dies like that circle one was. These are much thinner. And so if you don't have them secure in place, you run the risk of them actually shifting inside of the die cut machine and putting a little weird wonky edge to your panel, and nobody wants that. So that is a way that you can make sure that doesn't happen. So we're going to set that panel aside and we are going to move on to stamping. So today we are using 6 of our inks in 2 shades from each color family. So for reference, each of our color families actually have 4 inks that range from the lightest of lights to the darkest of darks. We are going to be using this really beautiful stamp layering set called Every Good Thing today. It is this really gorgeous layering floral that is just really modern and unique, and I just love the design of this one. There are tons of great stamp layering sets out there. This one is just something a little extra special to it. All right, so as you can see, we've got the layering guide on the background. Now, I am going to start with stamp A, and what you'll notice on our layering stamp sets now, as of our August 2020 release, is we have the stamp layering guide on the back, but then we also have letters next to each stamp layer on the stamp set itself that give you an idea of how to do it. Now, I do veer off from that here, and I will explain that as we keep going. But it's a really good reference to help make stamp layering really easy. So I'm stamping up this first layer. This is the first layer of leaves, and it is technically stamp A. So we are starting at the first layer, and I am stamping it in our aquamarine ink, which is the second shade in our aqua families. So this is where I deviate a little bit from the letters that you will see on the stamp set itself. So layer B is technically those smaller flowers that are in a larger grouping. But I am actually going to stamp the larger florals first. And the reason why I choose these ones is that I think that they're a little bit easier to layer within the leaves correctly. And then they actually act as a really great guide for that next set of florals. So I am stamping up this first set of florals in Coral Reef, which is the lightest shade in our red color family. And then we are going to go ahead and we're going to line up the second layer of these flowers. And now it's really great to use that stamp layering guide that's on the back of your packaging. It is really super helpful tool. You can also go ahead and use the first stamp layer as a guide as well. You'll see as you look at the images that you'll find little nooks and crannies that all of these fun layers go in. So now this second layer I am inking up in Passion Fruit, which is the second shade in our red color family. So as we continue stamping, I just wanted to chat a little bit about the ink pad promo we have going on for this show. So we are offering up 20% off of our full-sized ink pads in celebration of this collaboration show with Stamp and Scrapbook Expo and the Stamping Village members. In order to take advantage of that discount, you just need to use the code InkPads20, and that's 20, when you check out from pinkfreshstudio.com. Now, it is eligible only on full-size ink pads, so please be aware of that. And the code is valid from today, October 10th, through October 23rd at 11:59 p.m. Central Standard Time. All right, so we've gone ahead and stamped the 2 layers of the orange flowers, and those were stamped in apricot and clementine. And we have one final layer left. It is the second layer of leaves. And the reason why this is a great layer to keep to the end is because there are multiple points or multiple details on this stamp that line up really perfectly with especially the pink flowers. So it just makes it really easy to line up. And that is the finished result from the Every Good Thing stamp layering set. Now, off camera, I stamped it an additional time and trimmed it into 2 pieces, and you will see later on where that comes into play. So off camera, I went ahead and I die cut that second stamped floral piece, and I also die cut the word friend from our Phrase Builder Hello die set. I die cut the word friend 3 times, twice from heavyweight cardstock and once from glitter paper. And definitely don't forget to put your tittles in a safe place. I went ahead and I die cut the shadow layer from vellum. I don't know if I'm going to use it at this point, but I at least have it if I want to use it, and I can put it away if I decide not to. So I am just gluing the 3 layers of the friend word die together. I'm just using a glue pen. I like to use a glue pen for things like this just because it gives me some time to make sure that the layers are lined up perfectly. So now we are going to go ahead and stamp the sentiment. This is a piece of white cardstock that is trimmed down to 3.5 by 8.5. It is just slightly smaller than that scalloped circle panel. I'm going to use the scalloped circle panel as a guide because I want to stamp the sentiment directly to the background, but I also want it to peek through one of those peekaboo circles with the scallop around it. So the Misty platform is perfect for using that piece as a guide, verifying it's in the right place. And then once you have it all straight and aligned and make sure it's going to stamp nice and perfectly, I'm going to go ahead and stamp this sentiment in detail black ink. Now, I didn't do this on screen, but I am going to be honest that I did stamp it twice. And the reason being is I am a firm believer in just barely kissing the surface of your sentiment dies with your black ink and stamping lightly, and then going ahead and stamping it again to get that perfect impression. And the reason why I believe in doing it this way is because we actually have some really intricate sentiments in our stamp sets. And when you get those smaller, more thin fonts, you can really squish or push too hard, or if you have too much ink, it's going to pool. So I have just found that stamping twice and having a little bit of a lighter touch just works better for me. At this point, it is time to start putting this fun slimline card together. So I'm starting off, we have a 4x9 light orange card base, and I am adhering down that first layer with the sentiment. Up next is the scalloped peekaboo sentiment that we are adhering with some foam tape. I went ahead and took that release paper off camera so you wouldn't have to see me fumble with it on camera because no one wants to see that. And at this point, we're going to start placing those circles and arranging them so that they accent each peekaboo circle. So I didn't want to do 3 full circles because I did want some of those stitched scallops to be seen. So that is why I chose to only stamp 2 of the circle layers and then trim one of them to use just parts on each, the left and the right circle. So with those in place, I just glued them down with some glue dots. We are going to add the scripted friend word to finish off the sentiment. I just use a little bit of liquid glue to adhere that down. And as you can see, I decided not to use the shadow. So I'll just go ahead and put that back in the packaging and use it on a later date. Now, because I didn't use the shadow layer, I'm going to go ahead and adhere down the tittle inside of the peekaboo circle so that it is in the right placement over top of that eye. And then the final step for all cards that I create is it needs a little bit of bling. So I am going to use our crystals mix today. These are diamond shaped crystals, but they still work on cards because they have that flat top, not flat bottom, but flat top. And I am just adhering them to the side of the left side circle and the right side circle. I just arranged them in a little trio of an orange, a pink, and a clear crystal. I'm adhering them down with a liquid glue and using my jewel picker to set them in place. Well, that is my slimline card that I have to share with you guys today. I hope you enjoyed this, and I hope that it inspires you to create some of your own slimline cards as well. Be sure to check out our inks and our slim cuts dies and all of our amazing stamp layering stamp sets. We have a lot of them and they are really beautiful. So I am going to send you on over to my partner in crime, Heather. She has another card to create with you, and I know that you're just going to have a great time with her. So other than that, thank you guys so much for joining me, and I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day.
Hello, Heather Hoffman here, and I've got a bright sunny card to share with you with some stamp layering with our beautiful Pinkfresh Studio dye inks and a little bit of ink blending to make a creative background as well. I'm going to be using the Sending Love and Hug stamp set. It's a super easy layering stamp. There's 2 layers to the florals and 1 layer to the leaves that go together on this set. There's a wonderful layering guide on the backside that'll really help as you line up your stamp set. I am using 2 shades of pink ink, and I'm using 2 shades of green, even though there's only 1 layer there of the leaves. I'm going to do a little bit of ink blending with a blending brush to kind of get some depth on those leaves as well. Just another little trick to show a way to use those. All right, my favorite way to do layering stamps is to start first by die cutting the image with the coordinating dies. It kind of gives you a base to layer from, and you can use that negative space to start lining up your stamp sets if you have a stamp positioner such as a MISTI, which is what I will be using today. All right, so I'm going to lay my inks out here. I'm going to keep my layering guide nice and handy. I'm pulling out my MISTI, and I'm going to start with, first of all, I have a piece of inexpensive, just thin printer paper. Any paper or cardstock will work. And I'm setting this in my MISTI behind my negative die cut there. This is going to allow me a space to see what I'm doing as I line things up, and also a spot to kind of do a practice stamp to make sure that I have things lined up where I want before I actually stamp on that die cut piece. So I'm starting with that main large floral image. This is the most solid of the floral from this image. And you kind of want to just look around and line it up. You look for the big areas that match up in that negative space. The best way is to look around the sides, kind of tip your head down and get close, or look at it directly head down. It was a little hard for me to do that because my camera was directly above what I was working on. So I did a lot of looking from the sides and kind of tipped it up a little there to make sure it was lined up. Then, since sometimes that clear stamp will stick a little bit to your paper, I made sure and pushed that back into the corner. And I'm starting off with Ballet Slipper dye ink. And I'm going to ink this up. I'm not too worried about inking it perfect or stamping it perfect on this, because this is just kind of my quick little test to make sure it's in there where I want it to be. And now that I've stamped it, I can kind of look closely there and I can see that it's all centered exactly in that negative space. So now I'm going to set my die cut piece in there. And I'm going to go ahead and stamp with that Ballet Slipper. I'm purposely stamping this twice because Ballet Slipper is a really soft color, and I wanted to get a little more depth of color on there. So I'm going to keep it set in place and just stamp it again a second time over just to deepen the color a little. Not something you have to do. I just find that by layering them together, I can kind of get a little bit of a deeper shade. And you're also guaranteed good coverage if you missed inking up a spot or it just didn't stamp quite right. All right, now we're going to move on to that second layer, which is the detail on the florals. That's down in the bottom left corner of that stamp set. And this is where we're going to use that layering guide to kind of look at where you want to line those up. So you can kind of see the main large areas of it and then just match up those little spots and just kind of fiddle around with it, look at it, place it on there. It also can be a little bit helpful. My stamp's nice and clean here. As you're layering it over, if you kind of ink it up a little bit, especially with a red or a pink ink, that will slightly stain your stamp set, and that'll help you have a clearer picture of exactly where it's going to stamp. Just because red and pink inks are a little notorious for, it doesn't affect the stamping of the image, it just stains it ever so slightly. So sometimes that can be your friend for layering stamps like this. All right, I'm going to stamp that with Sparkling Rose. This is a much deeper shade, so there's my little test stamp, and I can see that based on my alignment guide, everything's lined up where I want it. Because this is a much deeper shade, I'm only going to stamp this once when I put my negative die cut in there, because I don't need this color super dark and deep. I just need it its base color, because it's going to add that dimension and the layer to the florals. All right, and there we go. Now we have all of the florals done. Just that one stamp, that one time, and all of our pinks are layered together. All right, now it's time to move on to that one leaf image. It's so handy how it's all just in one piece, which makes it really easy for stamping it on there. And the same thing, you can kind of see the key areas that you need to line up in that negative space. This is, again, we're using that negative die cut is super helpful with layering this up. You can do this just on white cardstock, but especially if you want to die cut it, it's definitely easier to die cut first and then line it up. So match it up with that layering guide. Make sure you have things where you want it in there. Kind of wiggle it around. You can see my face getting down low there to make sure I'm equally distant from all of those edges where it lines up. And then I'm going to do the same thing, and I'm going to stamp this in my lightest ink. I'm going to be using Mint and Meadow for the 2 layers here, but I'm starting off with the Mint. I'm going to do my test stamp in there and make sure that it's lined up as perfectly as I want it to be. and that worked. I missed a little on my stamp there, so I want to make sure it was all good, but it was perfect. So I'm going to lay that negative space in there, and then I'm going to stamp with this mint ink. This is another one of those super light, just pretty and soft shades. So I'm going to go ahead and ink that up a second time, just because, again, I want to get a little more of a deep color so there's a little less contrast between the two shades I'm going to use. All right, so this is completely done as it is now, but a fun way to add just a little more depth is to grab a blending brush and your next deeper shade of that green ink. And you can use that blending brush just to kind of dab a little bit more color. I'm doing it kind of at the base of each of those flowers, or I'm not flowers, the base of all the leaves. And because my stamp positioner will allow me to stamp it perfectly over the top of the others, when I stamp that over, it's just going to add a little bit of layering and depth to those leaves. Definitely not a step you have to do, but it just adds another little notch of a finish to that final floral cluster. All right. Now I've got my white card base and I wanted to add a layer of dimension. So I'm using fancy diagonal stripes. I've already pre-die cut this from white cardstock, and you can see that adds some fun texture there, but I want to make that die cut, since it's white on white, I wanted to make it pop a little bit more. So I'm going to use some of our dye inks to do a little bit of ink blending behind that. Our Pinkfresh dye inks were formulated to blend really well. I've had the best success with them with the softer blending brushes. These are life-changing blender brushes, and they're super soft and they just help make a really smooth, nice blend. I'm using Peach Fuzz dye ink for this, and I'm going to blend into the two opposite corners because I don't need to ink blend the entire background. I just want to make those corners pop a little bit to add some dimension to that die cut. Now, blending with dye inks, just like stamping with dye inks, you might look on there and notice it doesn't look like a super smooth blend yet. And that's totally par for the course with dye inks. As they sink in and dye the paper, both stamping and ink blending, they're going to smooth out and soften a little. So your color is going to soften up a bit as well. So if you're looking at it and feeling like it's a little bit blotchy or it's not quite as smooth as you want, give it a little bit of time. Use a soft touch, build up your color slowly. You can always add more color. It's really hard to take it away. All right, that's about where I want that ink blending to go, so I'm happy there. But I also want to add a little more texture. So for this, I'm going to use the next shade in our orange line, which is Apricot. And I'm going to smoosh it onto just a clear stamp block and grab a brush with a little bit of water. And I'm just going to add a dab of water to that. And then I'm going to use that brush to kind of mix that together to make almost like a soft watercolor. I wanted a little more ink there, so I'm smooshing that on the side there and mixing it together, trying to get the color dark. And then I just like to tap it over my finger. This just adds some little fine splatters, and I found doing it with the coordinating dye ink is a perfect tone-on-tone effect. And it also dries really quickly if you don't add very much water, only enough water to make the ink move. And then it dries almost instantaneously on that white cardstock. And it adds just a fun little bit of texture behind that. All right, now I was just confirming where I wanted to place those florals, but before I do that, I'm going to adhere that fancy diagonal stripes down. I'm using some liquid glue. This is just from Lawn Fawn. And I found you just need a little bit in the wider strips. You don't have to cover the whole thing with adhesive. It's I kind of actually prefer when I let the edges float free just a little tiny bit. I feel like it adds a little bit of dimension to that card layer. But it's going to hold nice and sturdy in place with a little bit of liquid adhesive. All right, gently pressing that into place. And then, now that I've got that adhered, the liquid glue also enables me to slide it a little if I didn't get perfect placement like on there. I could slip it a little bit to the right to get it lined up better. All right, now I'm going to add some foam adhesive to the back of this floral arrangement, making sure I have plenty for a good solid hold onto my card front. Then peel all the backing of those little pieces. Foam dots would work too. I prefer larger tape and just trimming it down to smaller pieces. All right, I'm going to adhere that right in the center. I played with different arrangements, but I ended up liking it just centered in the middle. And then I'm pulling back out that same stamp set, the Sending Love and Hugs. And I ended up using the sentiment that's the same as the name of the stamp set. I kind of laid a couple over and played with a few other options, but ultimately I decided to do that. And I love heat embossing sentiments on black cardstock in white. Something about it just makes them pop, and especially on a soft, pastel kind of card like this, using that black cardstock does a really good job of making it pop. I'm choosing a frame from Fancy Label Frames, and I'm picking one that just perfectly fits it there. I love all the options on there, and you can layer those together different ways, but I just picked the one size that fit my sentiment. But first I'm going to use my little scrap of black cardstock. I'm using an embossing powder tool that helps keep my embossing powder from sticking anywhere else from static or oils on my hands or anything else. That way when I stamp, I can be sure my embossing powder is just going to stick to my clear embossing ink where I've stamped my image. All right, stamp that there with the clear embossing powder, the clear embossing ink, added the white embossing powder, and then heat set that with my heat gun. I always love the magic of watching white heat embossing powder, and actually any embossing powder melt, but it just makes it so crisp and clean. And then I'm going to lay that little frame over the top. I decided to heat emboss it first, then die cut it. Then I wouldn't have to worry about lining it perfectly in that die cut. I could make it work afterwards instead. And I'm going to run that off camera and through my die cut machine. And there we go. It adds a fun shape to that. And now I just kind of had to play with, where did I want to put it on my card? I really didn't want to put it in the center and cover up so many of the florals. But as I kind of played with my placement, that ended up just being the only spot that seemed logical. Nothing else seemed to kind of feel right. So I ended up just going for that center spot. And I think in the end, it really balanced the card the best of any of the other options on there. I could have used a smaller sentiment to not cover up those florals, but I really love the way it worked out in the end anyway. I popped that up on foam adhesive as well. I know it's lots of dimension and more depth to the card, but it really does give it a fun finished look. I pulled out a few coordinating jewels from our Essentials Jewels mix. I actually ended up only using that lighter pink and that kind of pale yellow color. I pulled out those bright pink and I thought I would use those, but once I got those other colors on there, I ended up being pretty happy with that arrangement, and I decided not to rock the boat and add any of the darker pink. I like to pull out several colors at once though, and kind of play with not only the arrangement, as you can see here, as I keep kind of fiddling with where to place them, but sometimes I'll lay the different colors on, because in the jar, sometimes they look darker because you can see the backing of the jewels. But once you get them on your card, they're iridescent on the front, so they kind of reflect the light and the color a little different, and they tend to blend in and match a little better than you would expect onto your card. So I love that variety and how it allows you to stretch those jewels to some different options and colors along the way. All right, so I layered the creamy yellow ones in closer on top of the flowers and on top of that little sentiment panel. And then the pink ones are further out over that little ink blended area under the stripes. I'm using my jewel picker tool. This is a Studio Katia one, an embellishment tool, and a little bit of glossy accents to adhere those in place. And this card is finished. Lots of dimension, lots of beautiful ink, and lots of fun ways to use that ink, both for ink layering on a stamp and also a little bit of ink blending on the background. Thanks so much for watching. Have a wonderful day.
All right, thanks so much for joining us. I'm glad you could watch along and craft along with us as we played with some of our beautiful Pinkfresh Studio layering stamps and also some of our gorgeous array of Pinkfresh Studio die inks. Hopefully we were able to provide some fun tips and tricks and inspiration for you to pull out your own and play with, and maybe even some color combos and ideas for what you want to pick up to play with a little bit on your own. And don't forget that our die inks, all full-size in-stock die ink pads, are 20% off from October 10th to the 23rd. So it's a great time to stock up or grab a few to try if you're kind of new to them and want to take a chance to play with them. Thanks so much for joining us, and see you again soon.